Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
May of 2020 marks the 50th anniversary of the Kent State shootings. During this time of remembrance, we have the opportunity to examine our nation's appetite for wars and armed conflict. From Vietnam to Afghanistan and World War II to the current crisis in the Middle East, there's a lot to discuss. But why do we care about any of this? Why does this history matter? And why does our appetite for war matter? Well, as you might guess, a lot of our success as a nation has followed some trend lines of conflict. And then another side of this is obviously just the human life component. Anytime we're engaged in armed conflict, we put our own people in harm's way when we're engaging in these fights. So whether you care from the human life perspective, our success as a nation, or maybe whether you grew up during these times of war and conflict and your perception of them. So there's a lot of different things to discuss. We're going to look at all of that. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on history, war, and America without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, this is a topic, Justin, that's near and dear to my heart. We start talking about the United States and fighting wars. As you say, it's a large part of our history. But at the same time, things kind of changed, at least in my lifetime, with the experience that the country had with Vietnam. And I think it's kind of affected us in the last 50 years. And I say that 50 years because it is the 50th anniversary of the shootings at Kent State, which was towards the back end of the Vietnam experience. But still, I think that's had a major impact on how we have dealt with wars as a country and as a nation, as a people, since that time.
One of the things that we're going to look at in the second segment of the show is kind of how Afghanistan became an invisible war. But this actually, there's a bigger trend line here to look at, which is really interest since World War II in wars has drastically decreased, and especially since Vietnam. So as Lance brings this up, we want to make sure people understand this is kind of how the arc of the show is going to occur, how we're looking to talk about this. But to start with, as we've mentioned, this is the 50th anniversary of the Ohio National Guard opening fire on unarmed college students during a war protest at Kent State University. That was May 4th, of 1970. 4 students were killed and 9 others were injured. Not all of those hurt or killed were actually involved in the demonstrations, though. The demonstrations themselves opposed the U.S. bombing of neutral Cambodia during the Vietnam War. This is from an excerpt from a New York Times piece. We're going to have 3 different articles today. Of course, they're all linked at thestateofus.org. But before we go too far, I want to take an opportunity because we're fortunate Lance was actually alive during this time when all of this was going on. So tell us a little bit, Lance, how old were you and what emotions did you experience around the Kent State situation?
Well, it would have taken place just previous to my 9th birthday, is when it took place. But the entire Vietnam experience, I can start to pick up on around my 10th birthday, probably. So the thing was with Kent State, my dad just happened to be a graduate student at the University of Iowa, and my mom worked on campus. So I have them coming home and discussing the situation at the University of Iowa. So I was living in married student housing with my parents on a college campus at the time of this shooting. So it's in my memory bank. But by the time I was 12 and I was very much into, quote, the peace movement, I remember my grandmother bought me a sweatshirt that had a peace sign on it. And she asked my mom if it was okay to give it to me because my grandmother didn't know what the sign on the sweatshirt represented. And she was afraid it was going to say something bad. And she said, no, he'll really like it. And I still have pictures of that sweatshirt and wearing it and being proud to wear it. And then from there, I moved from Missouri to Ohio. And so I went to 7th grade. So I was 12, 13. And in Ohio, and I remember my sophomore year in American history class that we had a debate, and I chose to debate in favor of the students of Kent State. And this would have been 1975. So 5 years after, the Kent State shootings. And you would think at that time, this was towards the United States pulling out of Vietnam and ending things in Vietnam. You would have thought that the class would have voted for me. And while the teacher said I did a better job on the debate, I was outvoted 80% in favor of the National Guard. So the majority of my classmates said the National Guard was right with what they did, that those students deserved to be shot because they were protesting the government and the war, which I found very interesting. So the teacher said, as far as the debate, I won the debate. I did a better job of debating, but my classmates by an 8-2 margin were still in favor of what the government had done to these students. And that was 1975. You fast forward to my professional career, and as a basketball coach, we would take our high school girls team up to Kent State for team camp. And the head coach would have me each year for, I would say, probably 7 years then. Each year, I would take our basketball team around and walk through the place on campus and tell them what had happened at each place. And I was just up there last summer and got to share that experience with my niece, who was from California, and she had just graduated from high school. And she said, I have never heard of Kent State. So that was interesting. One, that she had had an American history class and graduated from high school in California, but had never heard of Kent State. And I was able to share that experience with her. So Kent State has played a major role in my life over the last 50 years.
So, and I think the other thing you and I discussed a little bit before the show, the interesting thing about this event, this, terrible tragedy, is that it was, I think, a big moment for the nation as a whole, because you have students, right, getting shot on a university campus by the National Guard of that state. And this, in a lot of ways, I think, was symbolic of how many young people were feeling, right, about the Vietnam War, which is that our government is forcing us into a situation that we don't want to be in. And so that in and of itself opens the door to this idea, which we're going to see throughout the rest of the show today, this whole normalcy or the normalizing of questioning the government, right? As opposed to just going along, like with a lot of previous wars, if the government said we're going to war, we rally behind it. The nation gets on board, and, as one nation, we go to war. But Vietnam became this very different encounter in that regard, because there was a lot of people who weren't supportive of it.
Well, in the beginning, the majority of Americans did support Vietnam, and, the anti-war protest grew. But in the beginning, again, the fathers and the uncles who were raising the young people had fought in World War II in Korea. And so when the country asked for people to fight in Vietnam, people said, yeah, it's my duty. I'm supposed to do this. But then people began to question the war. The war was televised. We talk about it as the televised fight, in that reporters were embedded and we were watching it on the news every night. And then they instituted a draft. And the interesting part here was we were drafting 18-year-olds, but at that point in time in history, the United States said you couldn't vote until you were 21. So that was one reason why young people kind of were leading the way in this revolt against the war, was that they were being forced to participate in the war through a draft that they didn't have the opportunity to vote on as citizens of the country. So I was being drafted at the age of 18, but I couldn't vote until I was 21. And, that caused a big issue as well, as far as, along with Nixon in Cambodia. And so the whole questioning of the government really came about here, that we see today really came about during the Vietnam time, and particularly after Kent State. And it also shows, too, the bad leadership or lack of leadership, because nobody on campus, including the governor in the state of Ohio, knew that the National Guard had live ammunition in their guns. The professors, the students, the governor of Ohio who had called out the National Guard, President Nixon, nobody knew that other than the soldiers themselves who had been told by their commander to put live ammunition in their weapons. So they were actually scared to be, if you read or listen to the oral histories of the people that were there, to a person, they say, we were scared of their bayonets. We thought they were going to do damage with their bayonets. We had no idea there was ammunition in the guns. And if there were, we figured it would be rubber bullets, which could still cause harm. But no, they were loaded with bullet-piercing armor bullets, was what they had in their M1 rifles.
So the question that we're going to continue to look at is America's appetite for wars declining? And in order to better examine that, we're going to take a look at wars post-Vietnam and see how they were received by the public, but also the type of news coverage they got and how many veterans each of these wars had, because that plays a big impact on our awareness and understanding of them. To find out why America has a declining appetite for wars, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Fewer American soldiers have fought in Afghanistan than any American war in the last century. At most, about 12,000 American soldiers remain there, and a total of about 600,000 have rotated through over 18 years. That number is less than a quarter of the number who fought in Vietnam and about half the number who went to Iraq, where many soldiers fought and died in less than half the time, increasing the visibility of their sacrifices. So what this piece from the New York Times shows, and that was a quote from that piece, you can find it at thestateofus.org, and I encourage you to take a look because it's got some good, and everybody will know, it's got some good charts, and so naturally I picked this out for us, but it really does do a nice job of illustrating an understanding of just how different these wars were in terms of living veterans. And you say, well, why does that matter? Why does the number of living veterans from a war matter? Well, when we look at World War II, Lance, you're talking about 16.1 million U.S. troops that served in World War II, okay? In comparison, when we come down to Afghanistan, you're talking about 600,000. Right? So the number of living World War II veterans, and Lance and I were talking a little bit about this before the show, there were almost 3 times or a little more than 3 times as many living World War II veterans as there were people serving in Vietnam. Okay? So think about that. I mean, the number of veterans was so drastically greater than the number of people actively going to war. And that's where Lance and I talked a little bit about mindsets. World War II was a very different war. I think the enemy was very clear. What we were fighting for was pretty obvious. And even when you look at in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, you see the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts, right? And even if you put those two together, the number of living World War II veterans still exceeded the number of people serving in those wars. And that's that mindset difference, I think, Lance, that you and I were talking about, right? So why did we get into certain conflicts, or why were the views on these harsher from some older people, of young people who were saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't be in these conflicts? Well, that's because of a different mentality about not questioning the government. And that's kind of what we left off in the last segment on, where, you know, new stuff comes to light and now we start talking about that. So one of the things that I think is important for us to discuss and take a look at is not just the declining number of veterans, but the increasing complexity of these wars, right? They're not as clean cut as some of what older people were used to.
If you talk about World War II, obviously, There were the Germans that needed to be defeated as a nation. There was the Japanese that needed to be defeated as a nation. There were the Italians. They were the bad guys. They were the enemy. And we had been attacked by those enemies. And so then it gave us an end game that once we defeated those countries and got them to sign surrender papers, we had, quote, won. We had accomplished our goal. We had a set goal. Okay. When you get into Korea, you get into a little different mindset. It's like, well, we have to stop the spread of communism, which we did, but then there was a stalemate and there was we need to bring them home because nothing is happening here. And we had a presidential election and Eisenhower wins because he says he'll bring the boys home. And so we, quote, stopped the spread of communism. We didn't wipe it out, but we stopped the spread of it. Vietnam's going on during this whole time in the background. And the United States continued to escalate its interest in the war until we get into the mid-60s. And Johnson says, we're going to send 500,000 troops, again, because we have to, air quotes here, stop the spread of communism in Vietnam. There were a lot of other things that were going on, but the belief was, okay, this is what our government has asked us to do. They asked us to do this before. So the older people are saying this is what we have to do. And the younger people, for the most part, said, okay, until we got, well, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Are we really stopping the spread of communism? Is there an ulterior goal here? Is there an ulterior motive? What's happening? We're taking young people who don't have the right to vote, and they're the ones that are doing the dying. You're telling us we're winning the war and we're killing more and more of the enemy, yet we're continuing to escalate the war even more. And that's where the questioning comes in. And there was no end point. And when it ended, we just left Vietnam and we left South Vietnam, and Vietnam became a communist country.
Right. So the mission that we went for didn't even really succeed.
And so the goal that we had said that we started to get involved in Vietnam, we didn't achieve that goal. We decided to quit fighting because the country lost the stomach for it, or the majority of the country lost the stomach for it. Some people thought we should still be fighting, in all truth. But then you go to today, and then so every time we go into a war, those of us who remember Vietnam are like, well, wait a minute, what's our reasoning? Who are we fighting? What's the end result? How do we know when we've won?
Well, and then if you fast forward to today, right?
And we really haven't had that. I remember when Saddam Hussein entered Kuwait to take over the oil fields. And, George Bush was the president. And we went in, and at 100 hours, man, we just pushed the Iraqis back and protected the oil fields. And he claimed victory, and all was good because that was our goal. We were going to keep the Iraqis from taking over the Kuwaiti oil fields and controlling the Gulf and keeping oil prices down. Okay, we did that. We achieved it. That was good. After 9/11, we were attacked by a terrorist group.
Right. So we go to war on terror, which is this whole different, how do you define when you've won, right? Because terror never goes away. So you embark on, because I think maybe saying even going to war on terror initially is not even fair, because it was more of, I think initially the idea was revenge, right? We were attacked. We have to respond. That's what we're doing. And then we're there and it's like, well, now we kind of have to come up with we have to solidify our reasoning here. So we're going to war on terror, and there's probably weapons of mass destruction. So now we got to take care of that, right? But then,
and the weapons of mass destruction came about because there had to be an end game. There had to be a reason to sell it to the American people. And then we found out there probably weren't weapons of mass destruction. And so now why are we fighting over there? Well, now we have to fight over there to protect the terrorists from attacking us again, which can be a very real reason. But again, it's not something you can grab a hold of. And when do you achieve that goal that you're no longer going to be attacked? It's not like,
right. Well, if you don't stay there, you don't achieve it. And that's the problem I think that we entered ourselves into, is a lot of people had an idea, because of the way that wars have always been fought in the past, is there's a way that you win and then you're done. And this isn't, and I think that's the thing that's difficult to understand. What we're doing, right? Nation building, fighting terrorism, you don't win those things. You're never done. You might win battles, right? But you don't ever win that war. It's just an ongoing thing. And so that's such a different thing. And to top it off, not only is it more complicated to understand, right, but the news coverage of all of this also was far less. When you look at the total number of headlines just in the New York Times, this is putting aside everybody else, you're talking about a huge decrease over other wars in terms of total coverage. Initially, there was a big spike, right, which is what you'd expect. But then it tapers off pretty drastically, and you don't have even close to it. So yearly war-related headlines, right, for World War II, it was 75 headlines. And then when you move to Korea, it's 50 headlines a year. And then by the time you get to Afghanistan, you're at 25 headlines, right? So you're at 1/3 the headlines that you were at for something like World War II.
Well, there are a couple of things at play here, though, right? Number one, there aren't as many veterans because we've changed the way we fight the war. With technology, we don't need as many troops, so there aren't as many people there. Secondly, none of these wars past Vietnam involved a draft. Everybody who's fighting there is, quote, a volunteer, somebody who said, I want to become part of the military. Maybe they didn't want to volunteer for a fight, but they became part of the military, and so that's part of their job. And so then that changes the whole dynamics as well, and that changes the news coverage because it's not like it's affecting the entire society. These are just the people who volunteered. So it's affecting a segment of our society, but it's not taking people from every segment of society. And so therefore it doesn't get the news coverage because not everybody's son or daughter is involved. It's only those who volunteered that are involved. So you only have that segment of the society who has something tangible invested in the fight. And so it's not as, quote, big a news story because there aren't as many people involved. And the way they're involved is you write it off. This is wrong to do, but we write it off and saying, well, they volunteered for this. So whatever's happening to them that's just what is going on. Whereas before in the three that you mentioned, the older ones, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, people volunteered, but they were also drafted. And so therefore it got wider coverage.
So the end question here that we have to look at is, has this change, is this a positive or negative for our nation as a whole? Because it is definitely a change. And I think it is fair to say that has our appetite declined? I think the answer to the question from my perspective is I don't know if the appetite has changed. I think the nature of questioning why we're doing what we're doing has increased. And that's an important distinction. At least I think it is, because there is a difference there. And this is something Lance and I were chewing on, is this idea, right, that our desire, and desire is not necessarily the right word, but our willingness to go to war, to put our people in harm's way. It's hard to know if that's changed as much as it has. We want to be really clear about why we're going in the first place. Like Lance said, post-Vietnam, especially people like Lance who were alive during that time, who probably know people that went off and died, and found out that their government was lying to them, hiding things from them. All of that feeds into this idea that we want to feel like we have the information necessary to support the effort from our government, and that we're not willing to just go do it because they said we need to. And I think, Lance, your point is well taken about these wars also have been primarily volunteer wars. I mean, we haven't forcibly compelled anybody to go fight. And that makes a big difference too. Because if you're going to fight a war and the people that you're sending are people who signed up for that job, that's a lot different than if you're going to fight and you're going to pull people from their jobs or school or whatever they're doing in their life and say, you're going to go fight and you might die, right? That's just there's a different nature to that. Yes, you're still putting our people in harm's way, but when you're forcing people to do it versus when that's something they've signed up to do, there's definitely a difference there as well. So positive or negative, Lance, what is your thought, this change in our discerning nature about whether or not to engage in armed conflicts?
Well, there's so much to talk about here, but just very quickly, it's a huge difference as someone who was on the younger side but remembers the draft. Instead of young people going off to college as many of them hope to, today when they get done with school, young men were being taken from their high school graduations and shipped to boot camp, and in a few short months then being dropped into the jungle of Vietnam to fight. So it's a totally different atmosphere and a reaction by the American public when you have a draft versus our volunteer forces. Having experienced both, it's just huge. I like, we talked about, the appetite, and I don't think the appetite has changed, but it's a questioning. The questioning now is there, and it goes back to, and I don't want to just pick, even though I can pick all day on Richard Nixon. But Johnson's in the Pentagon Papers, where we found out that Johnson had been lying to us since the Gulf of Tonkin in 1965, to Nixon, and Cambodia, which got the whole Kent State issue going. And then later, 10 days later, Jackson State down in Mississippi. I don't want to forget that as well. But then also Watergate that followed it. There was a whole generation of us now who have grown up questioning the government. And I think we see that now on a daily basis. But at the same time, I also remember us coming together as a nation after 9/11, that when we were attacked, we all wanted to do something. I also shared with you in our pre-show talk that being a peacenik from Vietnam, so to speak, if you could be in junior high, and high school, I went to college in 1979. And in the fall of 1979 was when the American hostages were taken in Iran by the Ayatollah Khomeini, when the Shah was flown to the United States and there was an overthrow of the government. And I came home and I told my mom, here is a guy who wore a peace shirt, right? Peace sign on his sweatshirt all through high school. And I went to college in my freshman year in college when our Americans were taken hostage in our embassy in Iran. I said, I'm volunteering for the service because we got to go get our people out of, there's no way that those Iranians should be taking our people hostage in our embassy. That embassy is our ground in Iran. That's like American soil. Those people don't have the right to take American citizens hostage on American soil. And I was ready to go fight. So here am I. I'm a peaceful person. I don't believe in war. But if you attack the United States, if you affect U.S. citizens openly like that, I think our appetite is still there. We just will question and say, is this worth killing American young people over? Whereas before Vietnam, it was our government said it, so we blindly followed. And so I think that's the biggest difference. And I think that's a positive. I think it holds our government, it holds their feet to the fire, and they have to serve the desires of the people, not their own agenda. And so I think it's a positive thing that we question whether or not it's something we should get involved in.
Obviously, with our mission here at True Chat, I think it would be far for either of Lance or I to say something like we don't think it's positive for people to be more discerning, to be more questioning. Of course, we think those are good things. I will say this. There is a caveat here that I want to put in. We have to be careful to not allow that mentality to serve as a justification to retreat from all world issues, because we can be involved in the world without killing people in the world. And I think too often we've decided that those are one and the same, that the way to exert our influence means sending our troops into harm's way. And when you're the most powerful economy in the world, you have other levers available to you, and not just economic ones. I guess my point there is just keeping in people's minds that those don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can still be a citizen of the world as the United States. We can still lead the world and not have to blindly go into armed conflicts. Those things don't have to go hand in hand, and I don't think they should. Sometimes it's justified, and in those situations, fine. But the rest of the time, let's be smart and stay involved, because that's how we avoid more armed conflicts, is by staying in the know and in the loop and making sure our interests are represented. We're looking at, coming up, modern war zones, particularly in the Middle East. This is one of those areas of confusion. But how are we getting that information? Who's responsible and who's to credit? All of that's very important when we think about how involved do we want to be there? What is the United States' role? To find out, keep it here on A State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Looking to the Middle East and to Syria specifically, this is something, as many of you know, that we've covered on The State of Us pretty regularly. We haven't done a lot of coverage over the last year, but we hit it hard for a few years, and this is a good opportunity to remind people just how severe the situation there is. The Syrian civil war has been underway for 3,340 days, more than 3,340 days. And according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is a monitoring group based in the United Kingdom, estimated the death toll since the start of the war to be as high as 511,000 people as of March in 2018. So probably even significantly higher now. Years of relentless fighting have left 6.6 million people displaced and 5.6 million people around the world, according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So it's a significant conflict, one that we don't hear as much about here in the U.S., but that nonetheless, from a foreign relations standpoint, should be of interest to us, because the reality is Russia, Israel, Palestine, these are people who have an interest in what's going on there, and we have an interest in those people. We're always paying attention to what they're doing, whether ally or adversary. So I think from that standpoint, it's of interest.
Well, the important thing, the important thing that you said, though, previously that connects right into this is that if, as the United States, if we're not leading, then my response is, if we're not leading, we're following. And so when these things are taking place around the world, if we're choosing not to get involved in them for whatever reason, okay, whether you agree that we should not be involved or, or we should be involved, if we choose not to get involved in world affairs, then we no longer are the leaders in world affairs. We're going to be a follower. And I've always laid it out that way when I discuss it with young people in my class, because I think most of us, even if we don't want to get involved in foreign affairs a whole lot, we would much rather have the leading voice in what's going on rather than having to react to what somebody else has done and giving up leadership. So that's the thing about leadership, is that if you're not leading, then you're following. And do we want to follow other countries? Do we want to follow the Chinese? Do we want to follow the Russians? Do we want to follow these countries that don't like the United States? Or do we want to continue to deal with some of these situations that aren't clean, that are kind of messy, but wouldn't we rather lead and help make the decisions and decide what's going to happen here rather than having to react to those other countries? Because if we leave, they're going to fill the void and they're going to make the decisions. And then we're going to have to respond to that later. And what history has shown us is that dealing with it later usually becomes even worse than if we dealt with it in the first place. So I think your closing statement goes right into what's been going on in Syria. None of us like being involved there in the Middle East. None of us want to put our troops in harm's way. But then the decision has to become, what is the outcome if we don't take any kind of interest? And like you said, there are other ways to take the lead other than armed conflict. We can still be leaders in this part of the world without sending in troops or without putting troops in harm's way. And I think, and it doesn't always have to be a military response, but I think that's a very significant point that you made, because if we don't lead, we're following.
Yeah. And you don't stay a leader by being a follower. I mean, that's just, sorry, basic logic there, right? You can't.
Well, I think it is, but we have this real push in the country right now that we just need to close our borders and take care of the United States. Well, history shows us, while you may want that, that's not what ends up happening when you do that. The times when we practice nationalism and close our borders, we get dragged into world affairs one way or the other. So I would much rather be out front and controlling the storyline and controlling what's being done than having to react to what is being done to us. That's my point as far as being a leader.
And I think right off of that is this idea that in times of crisis, whether at home or abroad, or like the situation we're in right now, from a global standpoint, people want somebody to lead, right? They want somebody to be there, to have the answers, to show the way, to say, this is where we go from here. This is the path, right?
And if it's not the United States, it'll be somebody else.
Exactly. And that's why it's important that because the interests of the United States, whether or not, again, this isn't really an opinion thing. I think this is just, you talk to economists, they're going to tell you this is the case. As we know, we are very reliant on the rest of the world for our economy, and vice versa. The rest of the world is very reliant on us. Just from a pure numbers standpoint, we can't afford, from a dollar standpoint and from, from an engagement with the rest of the world, we cannot afford to sit idly by as things happen. And I think especially when you're talking about something like the Middle East, where you have millions of civilians, right, who are being put in harm's way, and not of their own accord, and who are being displaced or killed as a result of this type of stuff, we have to ask ourselves too what we value as a nation. And there's, again, like Lance said, ways to be involved that are very effective that don't involve us invading these places either. But too often, I think we mistake those for having to be one and the same. The last little bit here that I think is important to mention as we close out is just that, like a lot of other things, and we talked about this earlier in the show, one of the reasons that people are challenged on what to do in the Middle East is not only is it a complicated situation, which we've identified makes it difficult, but the coverage is limited. And really, Lance, the coverage is limited to the few people inside of those countries who are using social media to get the word out, because traditional media has a really hard time operating effectively in those areas because they're the type of places where journalists get killed, as we know. As we've seen in the news. So I think it's important that we give credit to those people that are trying to make sure the rest of the world has access to information, because many of them are risking their lives just to make sure the rest of us know what's going on so that we can make informed decisions. And really, Lance, that's kind of a nice place to wrap things up, because it leads us to our mission statement and what we're trying to do here, right? On the State of Us and at True Chat, we're all pursuing this common goal.
Yes, our mission statement is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And if people want to broaden that conversation and help amplify this message so that we get others involved, this is released as a podcast and a syndicated radio program. So there's a lot of different ways to listen. But if our listeners want to invite people to the podcast version, how might they do that?
Well, they can follow us at Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else that fine podcasts are found.
Be sure to head over to thestateofus.org to check out the articles from today's show and to see all the different ways to tune in. The State of Us is released on Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.